Hi, how you doing today? All right, we'll go with that. Welcome to Multi-Org Magic with Salesforce Identity. My name is Kevin Porman. I'm a technical evangelist on the ISV TE team, and that's gobbledygook titles for I help ISVs be successful on the App Exchange. And this is
I'm Belinda. I'm a product manager here. And I look after our permissions, profiles, features, as well as a feature that I'm going to highlight for you at this session called external service registration. But with that, I have to show you this eye chart because external service registration is a beta feature that came out in summer with the current release. So there is a little bit of forward-looking things that I'm going to give you a peek into. So remember, make your purchases based on current GA functionality. Take it away, Kevin.
all right. So let's put together a little bit of an agenda and discuss what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to start with what the heck is a named credential. We're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about what the heck an authentication provider is. We're going to talk a little bit about why you should care about those two things and should be adopting them and thinking they're the coolest thing since sliced bread. And I'm going to show you a demo of communicating between two Salesforce orgs using named credentials and authentication providers. So a little bit of what you can do with it in the back end. Belinda, you want to do the
And then I'm going to continue that and show you how to use it in a very low-code way with external service registrations and doing some magic to connect up two orgs and do perm set assignments on a secondary org using an approval button on the first org. Then I will give you, like I said, a peek into some of the things that will make this new feature even better and more likely for you to adopt it.
Awesome. So let's start off with named credentials and authentication providers. Anybody familiar with these? We've got five, going once, twice, 5 people total. All right, a named credential is essentially an outbound fixture, an authentication fixture for outbound calls. If you want to pull things into Salesforce, you need a connected app. But if you're in Salesforce and you want to call out in an authenticated manner to a different API or anything else actually, you need to use a named credential, an authentication provider and named credential. Named credentials require the use of authentication providers, and you get some of them for free. So if you look at the little slide there as you go to create them, what I cut off there brilliantly was the little drop-down box to let you select which named credential you want to use. And you can set these up in 2 ways. Once you've chosen your authentication provider, you can set up your named credential to use per user, which is you're using the org and you log in, and when you go to make an authenticated call, it forces you to log in. And then when I go to do the same thing, I have to log in myself. From that point on, anytime he makes an authenticated call, it's using his credentials. If I make an authenticated call, it's using my credentials. The flip side of that, and the more common one, is actually the named principal. A named principal is one person who has the API creds or the authentication credentials for that service, logs in, and then everyone uses that set of credentials for the external service. So for example, if you're doing org-to-org work, you probably want to do probably want to do per user. And if you're doing from Salesforce to say, I don't know, getting currency rates, where it doesn't really matter the security or the user information being logged in over there, you might grab it that way. Does that make sense? Everybody feeling that? All right, so that's a named credential. Here's how you use them. This is the old style doing an old style call out. There's a lot of work here, a lot of boilerplate stuff. And if you notice that the second line down, we have a set endpoint. We're going to call this URL. We're going to set a method, give it a username and password, and that's just for basic authentication. Okay, that's basic stuff. If we had to get into OAuth, and even OAuth 1 is even worse, it gets a lot more complicated. This is, if you've written stuff on Apex for years, you're familiar with this. This is the way it works now with a named credential. It's a lot less code. You'll see also that the URL has changed. The big part about the URL changing is that we're saying call out colon, and we're giving it the name of our named credential. So remember 2 slides back when we had the little 3 bars and you could put in the name and that sort of thing. That's where you pull this up. You use that name credential, name, to make the call out. After the name credential name, you can put whatever path or information you need. If it's posting, you can create the post body, All that information goes there. You're just setting it there in that URL. That's all you have to do. All the authentication stuff is actually handled for you by the named credential. So, for instance, let's put some use case on this. You're going to log into another Salesforce org. It's OAuth going back and forth. So you choose the OAuth provider for Salesforce in the authentication provider. You get prompted to log in when this call is made. And from that point on, anytime you make a named call out to this Epic named credential, what happens is it automatically injects the access token into the header for you. Does that make sense? Whole lot less work. Also, it means that if the password changes, you don't have to redeploy code. Somebody can just go re-authenticate. So authentication providers back the named credentials. Named credentials allow you to make these authenticated callouts from Apex, and they're backed by authentication providers. They exist simply to be the other half of a authentication handshake between your system and the remote system. So if it's OAuth, then it's going to be the initiator that's going to kick off the OAuth flow between you and the external service. If it's there's a just basic digest auth that you can choose. And you can set these up declaratively. There are several, including this list here: Facebook, Janrain, Salesforce, OpenID Connect. But if you want to do your own, let's say you've got an OAuth 2 implementation that's not standard, you can create your own in code. So you can either choose from the drop-down, declare an authentication provider, put in your information, do it all declaratively, or you can actually write one in code. And if you're going to set one of these up, it does require that secret knowledge, whether it's the access token and consumer key for a Salesforce org, or, excuse me, not access token, the consumer key and consumer secret for a Salesforce org, or whatever access tokens you're given from where you're authenticating to. So you do need to know that to set those up. If you want to write a custom authentication provider, and this is actually really more common than you would imagine, you have to extend this one class, the auth provider plugin class. It's in the auth namespace, and there are 4 methods that you have to fulfill, and there's a 5th one that's optional. The 4 here are the get custom metadata type. You'll see why that happens in just a few minutes. We have the page reference initiate method. We've got a token provider response and a user data method. These are the big methods that have to be fulfilled, and what they actually look like is similar to this. So here we've got an Epic auth provider class, and we're going to extend that one interface. Now we're going to turn around and say this get custom metadata type, and we're going to return just a string of a metadata type. When you use the custom auth provider, it backs all of your data with a custom metadata type, so that if you sign up and I sign up and it's actually configured to be per user, it has a per user place to store this information. Does that make sense? So first step in setting these up, actually creating a custom metadata type and a couple of records in there. So once you've returned the string there, it's going to go grab all that information, and that's going to return that information to you in every other method as this map string auth config. So whatever your custom metadata type information is, it's going to be passed into all these methods here. So you can see what we're doing here is we're saying in our auth config, grab our authentication URL. We're going to use that, and that's from our custom metadata type. We're going to grab our client ID, and we're going to put those things together and come up with the state, and we'll end up returning a page reference URL. This is actually how we initiate the flow. In a named credential situation, if you haven't authenticated yet, your named credential will actually say, oh, I don't have an access token, turn around and call this method, the initiate method. This is where it really gets fun. After the initiate method and you've authenticated to the remote system, that's going to post a bunch of data back. And this is where the callback URL comes from. It comes into play if you're dealing with OAuth. And your callback URL will be passed into you as part of the state.query parameters. You can start using that, and you can do whatever you need in terms of other callouts, other things that you might need to do. But at the end, you have to return an object of auth provider token response. And that always requires a provider name, a token, a refresh token if you've got it, and a passed-in state. And that passed-in state is used with the refresh flow to grab a refresh token if needed. Now, I said the refresh token, if you have it, sometimes you won't have it because you've got a custom implementation, no refresh tokens. If you don't have a refresh token, pass null, it's a required parameter. You've got to put something in there. And lastly, after this is called and you've got an authentication and an access token, the system is set up, the auth provider system is set up to automatically call the get user info. And the idea here is that virtually every time you connect in an authenticated way to an external system, that credential, that information is tied to a user, and there should be an API to let you grab that user information. So you can say that Bob Smith in Salesforce org A did something as Jane Smith in Salesforce org B, and correlate those pieces of information together. To fulfill this method, really all you have to do is return a new auth user data object, and you can pretty much fill in all of these fields with nothing or made up information. So if you've got a situation where you've got a custom auth provider set up and there's no user API, no user data API endpoint for you to hit, create one. I've got one that I was just testing out where Daffy Duck is making all my authenticated calls. So this is up to you to put as much fidelity as you see fit into, but you do have to create it because it will be automatically called. So what can you do with named credentials and auth providers? Well, the auth provider is going to give you custom authentication or standard authentication, depending on whether or not you choose to implement it yourself. And when you've got that, you can make the name credential callouts directly to that external service in an authenticated manner. It's also going to bring you some other ancillary things. Deployment-free configuration changes, and the ability to test to mock tests better. Because you're using a name credential, you can build a HTTP callout mock generating class that returns different functions based off of the callout name. And so you can have one class that pulls those all together. And so let's look at actually a kind of an unintuitive use here. I'm going to switch out of PowerPoint and log into a Salesforce org. I want to show you how this is set up. This is where you get to the actual creation of an auth provider. I'm going to create a new one here, and I can choose the provider type. And I've got this one down here, the push package auth provider. You'll notice it has a different naming convention. This is a custom one I've written, but as soon as you save and compile a class in your org that extends that auth configuration, the plugin class, it shows up here in this list. Okay, so I could create that, or I could choose one of these others. I've already got one created, but when you choose it, here's where you start filling in information. You got to give it a name and then the URL suffix. Those are used as part of the authentication process with OAuth, and you have to choose who it executes as. Everything else is just sort of gravy here. But when you set that up, you can then switch over and create a named credential. In this case, I've created a named credential called packaging org, and I've got a URL here. Now this name credential bundles a whitelisted URL. So remember when you're doing old school callouts, you have to go whitelist that in security settings, the URL you're calling out to. When you do a name credential, that's pulled in automatically. You get the whitelist from the URL here. And I've chosen a name principal and an authentication protocol of OAuth 2. And this is all set up. So I've already set this all up for us. I'm going to give you a little demo of what you can do with it here in the console. I'm going to run some code here. This is very similar to the code I had in the slide. All I'm going to do is I'm going to make a call out to a different org, and I'm going to run an Apex query. So this is an Apex to Apex API integration. And I'm going to say, give me the name from accounts for all the accounts. I'm going to run this as a GET request, and then I'm going to dump the body to the screen so we can look at it. So if I run this, yay, it succeeds. And if I open it up, buried in the swath of text is actually all of the results that I pulled back. In this case, you can see that there are total of 12 records, and here they are starting in this JSON array. So with a name credential and an auth provider set up between two orgs, you can actually start doing org-to-org communication at a raw Apex API level, whether that's the reporting API or the Apex S-Object API. You can take bits of data from one org and use the name credential callout into a wave system in another org. The sky's really the limit here with how these are set up. So that's name credentials and authentication providers in a nutshell. Happy to talk about them more with you afterwards, but let me hand it over to Belinda. and get back into PowerPoint.
So I'm actually going to extend Kevin's demo example and combine it with something called external service registration to do that call out that you saw that he built the call out class to do with something that you could declaratively import into an org. So let me start with just this description of what this external service registration is. You find it's essentially a way to do remote actions without writing an Apex class. That means you don't have to test an Apex class. It's just going to appear as an action that's usable in Flow or Process Builder. You're going to... OK. Here's where you find it on your setup menu. There is a new node in the Lightning setup tree called Integrations Beta. You'll find the wizard to be able to use this process, and I'll walk you through it in a bit. It uses the name credentials that Kevin talked about as the way to put your endpoint and for authentication. It's a beta feature since spring of 17. It's a 5-step Lightning wizard, and it generates dynamic Apex actions that's usable in Flow and Process Builder. But there is a little bit of magic that we have to do to connect those clicks that I'm talking about to what that dynamic code is. And the magic, it's a JSON schema. So in the beta, we support something that looks like this. The bit.ly URL gives you the full schema that I'm going to be using in the demo. But I want to call out the fact that the format that we support currently is something called interagent hyperschema. If you use Heroku, you'll know that that's the format that they use to describe their platform APIs. And then what I've also taken a sample in this slide is to show you the links section in that schema that's describing the post or the HTTP actions that you want to be able to be importing. So let me just describe the demo that I'm going to do for you. I'm going to have two orgs. You are Wile E. Coyote. You operate in an identity org where you're signing in, and then but your sales org is where your sales operations are happening. So you're going to make a permission request in the identity org that will then create a remote action into our sales org and give you an extra perm set so that you can have quotes edit as part of that request. So this is what we're going to show through. So let me switch over.
Sorry. There you go.
Thank you. All right, so this is one of the things that I'm not sure Kevin mentioned was in order for me to connect these two orgs together using the name credentials, one of the things I did have to do is enable my domain on both orgs so that they now have the special domain you see up there. So this is my identity org. So if we take a quick look at what that auth provider looks like, so I'm connecting to a secondary org that I'm calling org A that has my domain for that second org, and it's going to be using OAuth 2 as well as the authentication method. And here's a quick look at the name credentials where I've created that connection. So I'm authing in as a user, a specific admin user in that sales org that's going to have, I can constrain it to they only have the ability to manage permission set or assign permission sets, or if I'm going to connect more administration services, I can make that user more powerful or create different name credentials to be able to scope that better from a security perspective. So here is the bit.ly URL will take you to this schema. So let me just show you the magic of the cut and paste of the schema into that wizard. So if I go and register a new wizard, I will see I will see a 5-step process. The first is I'm going to give it a name. This is my new test. And then if the service hosts a schema on their side, you don't even have to know it. Your developer can create the schema on their side. In this case, because we're connecting to a Salesforce org and we don't yet have a way to emit our own schema descriptions, I'm going to paste in that schema from the gist. And then when I save,
You're missing a final curly
am
brace.
I missing the? Thank you. There we go. So it's parsing that schema. I'm going to have it use that name credential that I've created. And now you see the action that it actually dynamically created from that schema. So I'm going to be able to assign a perm set if I give it a perm set ID and an assignee ID or user ID of my target org. It shows up in the flow designer. Oh, you don't have Flash on your. OK. So unfortunately, this is not my. So I can open up the Flash.
Some are saying that will automatically work anyway.
Live demo.
There you go. There you go.
OK. So in the flow designer, those actions that got imported show up here as Apex actions. And if you take a look at it, it will have the inputs and outputs that was described in that screen when we imported that external service. OK, so for the purpose of this demonstration, I've hard-coded the perm set and the ID of my Wile E. Coyote user in my second org. This is my org A. And you'll see there's no perm set assignments currently assigned to this user. So I'm going to go ahead and run my flow. I'm going to run this flow. Oh, sorry. I don't think that was the right one. My apologies. OK. I ran the flow, and it actually assigned that quotes perm set in the background. I had a small error in that flow, so my apologies. But that is external service, name credentials, and remote actions happening all together.
Putting it all together. So,
sorry, that little flash thing just threw me off. So I'm going to let you know what are the things coming up with this beta service. So as I mentioned, the current JSON schema it only supports is that interagent hyper schema. We're working to be able to import in open API specs. This is the Swagger 2.0. That is a standard out there for describing any APIs. So obviously, my example was connecting two Salesforce org together, but you can also use this external service registration to connect up any APIs out there. IBM, Watson, all of their APIs are described with Swagger. We're going to be including that into this feature. We're also looking to make these actions asynchronous. Today, they're going to happen synchronously, meaning as soon as you make the call out, it just happens. We want to be able to make it so that it doesn't have to be part of the same transaction. We are going to allow these external service registrations to be packageable in managed packages so that ISVs can take advantage of them. And we want to make these dynamic Apex actions available to other Apex classes. Today, you only see them in the Flow Designer, all in the Process Builder, wherever the invocable actions are viewable today. And finally, from a wizard's perspective, we want to be able to incorporate the name credential creation as part of the wizard. Today, you have to do the work ahead of time to create that. And I'm going to close with a call to action and for you to go and take a look at some of these trailhead contents that are out there related to identity. There's a whole identity trail that you can go and learn about the basics. There's not as much detailed on the name credentials, but it does touch a little bit on the auth providers, I think.
It mentions them.
Yeah. And there's also modules on the Apex integration service that'll help you figure out when it's appropriate to use external service as a call-out versus some of the other data integration processes. So with that, I think we're ready for some Q&A.
And the rule is with me, if you don't ask questions, I'll ask them of you. That can, if you don't know the answer either, then we're awkward. So ask questions. Yep. Okay, so let me repeat the question for everyone here. His question is, can you package a name credential such that you can loosely couple two orgs and services? Yes and no is the answer to the question. If you go to, the only way to get an auth provider in a package is to include a named credential. It gets pulled in automatically as part of the named credential. You can't add an auth provider by itself. Once that is in a package, you cannot change it or remove it from the package or change it in the package. Ever. Right now, at least. Most importantly, if there's anything dynamic about the named credential or the auth provider for the customer to fill in, you can't package it. You're going to have them create it themselves. Another slight gotcha is maybe the right word, is that while you have Apex access and control to both the auth provider record and the named credential record, you can't insert them, right? So one thing that would be really powerful would be to say, here's a packaged authentication provider by itself, and I know from talking to you that you're on, NA17 rather than, NA35, and then create a named credential in code and save it. You can't do that today. I'm trying to yell from every rooftop about that because name credentials are useless until you've actually authenticated, so the ability to insert them doesn't seem like that big of a risk to me. And that could be wrong, there could be other things to it, but I'm still yelling about that one. Other questions?
We'll add that with the external service registrations, when you package those, they're going to reference the name credential based on a developer name. So while I'm not solving your problem around creating that name credential post-install, you can have a different name, the contents of the name credentials being different, associated with the same packaged external registration.
And if you're talking org to org, you can always spin up NA1 through NA whatever. Right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, say that again. Salesforce limits it would apply to which feature? Named credentials, auth providers, or external services? Your auth provider is still going to be, if you have a custom one, it's still going to be tied to Apex limits around CPU time, DML, practically speaking, I can't think of a situation where you would run into those. You may run into a problem where you can't DML after one of the callouts if you're trying to save something in a weird spot. But the examples that exist and most authentication flows that you're going to run, it's not going to be an issue. In terms of named credentials, you're still going to hit limits on timeouts. So if your authenticated call just times out, you've probably got a typo or the service is down. CPU time there as well. I'm trying to think if there's anything specific to those, and nothing is coming to mind. Are you aware of any?
The callouts will, if the response on the other end, there's the timeout limits associated with that. If you're connecting two orgs together, it counts as an API call on the other org.
Sure.
Other than that, I can't. I mean, the nice thing about external service registrations is it won't generate Apex code that will count against your code.
The other one that I think you might run into, that I at least have run into, is total response size. So it's not a panacea for trying to ingest large amount of data. Great question.
Yes. So the external service is a way for you to be able to, if you can describe the external REST service in a acceptable schema format to us. Like I said, currently with what's in production today, it's this interagent hyper schema format. In the future, we're looking at Open API, Swagger 2.0 type formats. If you can describe that, and you put it into our external service, put that metadata into the org that wants to make the call out, then it dynamically generates those actions that you've described as invocable Apex actions to be used in Flow. Process Builder is a little bit challenging because there is the DML restrictions, so that's where you may still have to write a little bit of a class to wrap it as an add future or async callout. Make sense? I think we're over time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll be to the side if you have more questions.